For years, these pieces of evidence formed the backbone of the intruder theory. The Ramsey family's defense team seized on Smith's findings, presenting them as proof of their innocence. Media outlets reported extensively on the mysterious intruder who had somehow infiltrated one of Boulder's most exclusive neighborhoods undetected. But other investigators weren't convinced. They began their own analysis of Smith's evidence, and what they discovered was devastating to his theory. The alleged stun gun marks were the first to be debunked. Dr. Michael Doberson, a forensic pathologist, conducted extensive testing and determined that the marks on JonBenét's body were consistent with something much more mundane, the end of a toy train track that was found in the basement. The spacing was identical, the shape was a perfect match, and unlike a stun gun, the train track was actually present at the crime scene. This revelation was staggering. The centerpiece of Smith's intruder theory, the evidence that suggested a sophisticated attacker with specialized equipment, was actually just marks made by a child's toy that any family member could have picked up. But the debunking didn't stop there. The basement window that Smith claimed was the intruder's entry point showed no disturbed dust on the windowsill, no spiderwebs broken, no evidence that anyone had recently passed through. The window well outside showed undisturbed debris that would have been scattered if someone had climbed through. Even more damaging was the analysis of the boot print Smith had found. Initially presented as evidence of an unknown intruder, the print was later matched to one of the investigators who had processed the scene. It wasn't evidence of the killer, it was contamination from the investigation itself. The disturbed snow outside the basement window? Crime scene photos showed the disturbance was caused by police officers during their initial search, not by some fleeing intruder. One by one, every piece of physical evidence supporting the intruder theory collapsed under scrutiny. But Smith's most controversial decision was yet to come. In September 1998, just 1 month after Steve Thomas's resignation, Lou Smith also resigned from the investigation. But unlike Thomas, who left because he believed the family was guilty and the system was protecting them, Smith left because he believed the family was innocent and investigators were focused on the wrong suspects. Smith's resignation created a perfect media narrative. Two experienced detectives, both leaving the same investigation, but with completely opposite conclusions. This gave the impression that the evidence was so ambiguous that even experts couldn't agree. But here's what the public didn't know. Smith's resignation wasn't just a professional disagreement. According to sources within the investigation, Smith had developed an unusually close relationship with the Ramsey family. He'd been invited to their home, spent social time with them, and seemed more like a family advocate than an objective investigator. This raised serious questions about Smith's objectivity. Had he become so personally invested in proving the family's innocence that he'd lost his investigative neutrality? Were his theories driven by evidence or by emotional attachment to the people he was supposed to be investigating? Former FBI profiler John Douglas, who also worked on the case, later admitted that investigators who spent too much time with the Ramseys often found themselves influenced by the family's charm and apparent grief. It was a psychological phenomenon that had compromised other high-profile investigations. But perhaps most disturbing was what happened after Smith's resignation. Instead of quietly moving on, he launched what amounted to a public relations campaign for the Ramsey family. He gave interviews, consulted with their defense team, and continued promoting his intruder theory even after its evidence had been scientifically debunked. Smith's actions provided crucial cover for the Ramseys. Every time media outlets questioned their innocence, defense attorneys could point to this legendary detective who believed an intruder was responsible. It didn't matter that his evidence had been discredited. His reputation alone was enough to create reasonable doubt in the public mind. Meanwhile, Steve Thomas's evidence against the family was largely ignored by mainstream media. His resignation letter, with its detailed analysis of why the ransom note was fake and why Patsy Ramsey was the likely author, received far less attention than Smith's intruder theory. This created a devastating imbalance in public perception. The debunked intruder theory dominated headlines while legitimate evidence pointing toward family involvement was marginalized or ignored entirely. But here's the question that should haunt everyone following this case. Why was so much effort invested in promoting a theory that couldn't withstand scientific scrutiny? Why were investigators like Steve Thomas, who presented credible evidence of family involvement, treated as pariahs while those promoting debunked theories were celebrated? And before we go deeper into these troubling questions, let me address something that's been bothering me. We're diving into evidence that took investigators years to uncover, revealing information that mainstream media largely ignored, yet 98% of you watching haven't subscribed. If this level of investigation interests you, if these revelations are worth your time, then why not subscribe? Or if you won't, at least tell me why in the comments. What would it take for you to support this kind of in-depth research? Because what we're about to explore next will shake your understanding of this case even further. The psychological profile of the killer was about to reveal disturbing truths that investigators could no longer ignore. Dr. Stephen Pitt didn't mince words when he delivered his psychological profile of JonBenét Ramsey's killer. As one of America's foremost forensic psychiatrists, Dr. Pitt had analyzed some of the nation's most disturbing crimes. But the Ramsey case presented psychological patterns that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't a random act of violence, Dr. Pitt concluded after months of analyzing every aspect of the crime. This was personal, intimate, and committed by someone who knew this child well. His analysis began with the crime scene itself. The location where JonBenét's body was found, the wine cellar in the basement, wasn't chosen randomly. It was the most secluded area of the house, a place where someone could work undisturbed for hours. This suggested the killer was intimately familiar with the home's layout and felt comfortable spending extended time there. But it was the nature of the violence that revealed the most about the killer's psychology. JonBenét had suffered what experts call personal cause homicide, violence that went beyond what was necessary to cause death. The staging of her body, the way she was positioned, the items found with her, all pointed to someone working through complex psychological issues related to the victim. Dr. Pitt's analysis of the ransom note revealed even more disturbing psychological markers. The length of the note, 187 words, was extremely unusual. Most ransom demands are brief, functional communications. This note was verbose, almost conversational, suggesting the writer felt compelled to explain, justify, and manipulate through words. The tone of the note also revealed critical psychological information. Despite claiming to be from dangerous kidnappers capable of beheading the victim, the overall language was oddly respectful toward John Ramsey. The writers called him Mr. Ramsey, asked him to be well rested, and seemed almost apologetic about the situation they were creating. This psychological contradiction made no sense for actual kidnappers, but made perfect sense for someone who knew and typically respected John Ramsey, but was temporarily in conflict with him. Dr. Pitt's analysis also focused on the killer's post-crime behavior, which he found even more revealing than the crime itself. The way the family responded to their daughter's death, the controlled grief, the strategic communications, the immediate hiring of defense attorneys, suggested what he called guilt-driven behavior management. Normal grief, according to Dr. Pitt, is chaotic, unpredictable, and often self-destructive. Grieving parents typically can't function normally for weeks or months. They make irrational decisions, struggle with basic tasks, and often require medical intervention. The Ramseys' behavior pattern was the opposite: methodical, strategic, and focused on controlling information flow and public perception. Within days of their daughter's death, they had retained one of Colorado's most prestigious defense firms, hired a public relations team, and begun managing their public appearances. This wasn't grief, Dr. Pitt observed. This was crisis management. But perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Pitt's analysis of the family dynamics that multiple witnesses had described. The perfectionist household, the intense pressure on JonBenét to succeed in beauty pageants, the mother's obsession with appearances, and the father's emotional detachment, all created what he called a pressure cooker environment, where violence could erupt suddenly. Dr. Pitt had seen this pattern before in cases involving family violence. Households that appeared perfect from the outside often harbored intense internal pressures. When those pressures reached a breaking point, the results could be explosive and tragic. The bedwetting issue that housekeeper Linda Wilcox had described was particularly significant in Dr. Pitt's analysis. 6-year-old children who still struggle with nighttime bladder control often face shame and punishment that can escalate into abuse. In households obsessed with perfection and appearances, such failures can trigger disproportionate anger. Dr. Pitt's research into similar cases revealed a disturbing pattern. When parents invested heavily in a child's public success, whether in sports, academics, or beauty pageants, any behavior that threatened that investment could trigger explosive rage. The psychological profile Dr. Pitt developed wasn't just academic theory. It was based on decades of research into family violence, child abuse, and the psychology of parents who kill their own children. His conclusions were supported by statistical analysis of similar crimes and psychological patterns that appeared consistently in such cases. According to his analysis, JonBenét's killer was likely someone who loved her but felt betrayed by her behavior on Christmas night. The violence was personal, driven by rage and disappointment, then followed by panic and elaborate staging to conceal the truth. The ransom note served a dual psychological purpose. It misdirected suspicion away from the family, while allowing the killer to maintain some sense of control over an increasingly chaotic situation. Writing the note provided time to process what had happened and begin planning how to survive the aftermath. Dr. Pitt's profile also explained why the crime scene was so extensively compromised. This wasn't accidental contamination, it was psychological necessity. The killer needed to create confusion, eliminate evidence, and build plausible alternative explanations for what had occurred. But here's what made Dr. Pitt's analysis so controversial. It pointed directly toward family involvement in a case where authorities seemed determined to avoid that conclusion. His psychological profile contradicted the official narrative that was being promoted to the public. When Dr. Pitt presented his findings to investigators, the response was telling. Instead of embracing his analysis, officials seemed uncomfortable with conclusions that challenged their preferred theories. His profile was largely ignored by those who could have acted on it. This pattern of ignoring inconvenient evidence was becoming a theme in the Ramsey investigation. Witnesses who pointed toward family involvement were discredited or marginalized. Evidence that contradicted the intruder theory was downplayed or suppressed. And you know what? This pattern continues today with this very video. Here we are presenting evidence and analysis that most people never hear, yet 98% of viewers won't subscribe. If this psychological analysis is opening your eyes to aspects of the case you never considered, if Dr. Pitt's insights are changing how you understand what happened to JonBenét, then why not subscribe? Or if you won't, tell me why. What would convince you to support in-depth investigative content like this? Because Dr. Pitt's psychological profile was just the beginning. What investigators were about to discover would make his conclusions seem conservative by comparison. The truth about what really happened in the Ramsey household was about to be revealed by those who knew the case best. By 2012, nearly 16 years after JonBenét's murder, something unprecedented began happening in the world of criminal investigation. The detectives, prosecutors, and experts who had worked the case, and who had been silenced by legal constraints and political pressure, finally began speaking the truth about what they'd discovered. What they revealed would shatter the public's understanding of the case forever. James Kohler had served as the lead investigator for the Boulder District Attorney's Office. For years, he'd remained silent about his conclusions, bound by professional obligations and legal restrictions. But in 2012, he published a book that exposed the investigation's most closely guarded secrets. Kohler's revelations were devastating. After analyzing every piece of evidence, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, and consulting with dozens of experts, his conclusion was unequivocal. There was no credible evidence that any intruder had ever entered the Ramsey home that night. The physical evidence tells a very clear story, Kohler wrote. And that story doesn't include some mysterious outsider who somehow navigated through this house, committed murder, then vanished without leaving any real trace. But Kohler went further than just debunking the intruder theory. He identified who he believed was responsible for JonBenét's death, and his conclusion shocked even seasoned investigators. According to Kohler's analysis, the evidence pointed toward Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother, as the person who struck the fatal blow. This wasn't speculation. It was based on concrete evidence that had been suppressed for years. The timeline, according to Kohler, began with a late-night incident between the siblings. Burke had a history of behavioral problems that the family had worked hard to keep private. On Christmas night, something happened that triggered a violent response from the boy toward his sister. Evidence supporting this theory included Burke's own admissions. In interviews with child psychologists, Burke had made statements that suggested he knew more about his sister's death than he'd publicly revealed. His drawings and play therapy sessions revealed disturbing preoccupations with violence and death. There was also physical evidence. Burke's fingerprints were found on the bowl of pineapple that investigators believe JonBenét had eaten shortly before her death. This placed him with his sister during the crucial time period when the fatal injuries occurred. But perhaps most significant was Burke's behavior in the days following the murder. While his parents displayed controlled grief and strategic crisis management, Burke seemed oddly unaffected by his sister's death. He played video games, showed little emotion, and asked few questions about what had happened. Child psychologists who observed Burke noted behaviors consistent with a child who had committed violence, but didn't fully understand the consequences of his actions. His detachment wasn't grief, it was psychological self-protection. Mark Beckner, who had served as Boulder police chief during the investigation, supported Kohler's conclusions. In a 2014 interview, Beckner stated that the evidence strongly suggested family involvement, with Burke as the most likely perpetrator of the initial violence. The totality of the evidence has always pointed in one direction, Beckner revealed. The challenge was proving it in a court of law, especially when dealing with a juvenile suspect and a family with unlimited legal resources. Detective Steve Thomas, whose resignation had exposed the investigation's political compromises, also confirmed that Burke had been a focus of legitimate suspicion from early in the case. His 2000 book revealed that investigators had identified behavioral patterns and evidence suggesting Burke's involvement, but had been prevented from pursuing this line of investigation aggressively. Even more damning was the revelation from former prosecutor Michael Caine, who had led the grand jury investigation. In 2013, Caine confirmed that the grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, not for murder, but for child abuse resulting in death and accessory to murder. This meant that after hearing all the evidence, including testimony that the public had never seen, 18 citizens concluded that the Ramseys had failed to protect their daughter and had helped cover up her murder. The district attorney had simply refused to sign the indictments. The picture that emerged from these revelations was horrifying. According to the investigators who knew the case best, 9-year-old Burke had killed his sister in a moment of rage, possibly over the bowl of pineapple or some other sibling dispute. John and Patsy had discovered the scene and made a decision that would haunt them forever. They chose to protect their surviving child by staging an elaborate cover-up. The ransom note wasn't written by kidnappers. It was Patsy's desperate attempt to create an alternative explanation for her daughter's death. The basement staging wasn't the work of some sadistic intruder. It was parents trying to make their daughter's death look like the result of external violence rather than family dysfunction. This theory explained everything that had puzzled investigators for years. It explained why John knew exactly where to find the body. It explained the family's strategic crisis management instead of chaotic grief. It explained why they immediately hired defense attorneys and public relations teams. Most importantly, it explained why the case had never been solved. You can't convict a 9-year-old of murder, and proving that parents covered up their child's crime requires evidence that the family had spent years destroying or concealing. But these revelations raised even more disturbing questions. If multiple investigators, prosecutors, and experts had reached similar conclusions about family involvement, why had the public been fed a steady diet of intruder theories and false suspects? Why had the media focused so intensively on debunked evidence while ignoring credible analysis pointing toward the family? Why had a case with clear indicators of family violence been transformed into a mystery about some phantom killer who left no real evidence? And here's a question for you. Why are you learning about these revelations from this video instead of from mainstream news coverage? If this information is as shocking to you as it was to the investigators who lived through it, why haven't you subscribed to support content that brings you these suppressed truths? And if you won't subscribe, tell me why. What's stopping you from supporting investigative work that goes beyond surface-level reporting? Because what we're about to explore in our final section will bring this 28-year journey full circle, revealing how all these pieces fit together and what they mean for justice, truth, and the memory of a little girl who deserved so much better. As we reach the end of 2024, 28 years have passed since JonBenét Ramsey's murder sent shockwaves through America and changed the landscape of true crime forever. The little girl who would have celebrated her 34th birthday this year remains frozen in time as the 6-year-old beauty queen whose life was cut short on Christmas night. But what have these 28 years taught us about justice, truth, and the power of wealth to shape reality? The witnesses whose voices we've heard throughout this investigation, Linda Wilcox, Brian Scott, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, Detective Linda Arndt, Steve Thomas, James Kohler, and others, all shared one common experience. They spoke truth to power, and power rejected their testimony. Each of these individuals possessed crucial pieces of the puzzle. Wilcox witnessed the family dynamics that suggested dysfunction beneath the perfect facade. Scott observed the crime scene before it could be completely compromised. Hoffman-Pugh identified evidence that pointed toward family involvement. Arndt experienced firsthand the chilling moment when she realized she might be alone with a killer. Steve Thomas presented compelling evidence that the ransom note was fabricated by Patsy Ramsey. James Kohler revealed that investigators had identified Burke as the likely perpetrator of the initial violence. Multiple experts concluded that there was no credible evidence supporting the intruder theory that dominated public perception. Yet for 28 years, these voices have been marginalized, discredited, or silenced entirely. The narrative that emerged victorious wasn't the one supported by evidence. It was the one backed by unlimited legal resources and sophisticated public relations campaigns. The Ramsey family hired some of Colorado's most prestigious defense attorneys, retained crisis management specialists, and cultivated relationships with sympathetic media outlets. They transformed themselves from potential suspects into victims of a flawed investigation, portraying every attempt to examine their involvement as persecution rather than legitimate inquiry. This strategy worked brilliantly. Public opinion shifted from suspicion of the family to sympathy for their plight. The focus moved from analyzing evidence of their potential guilt to criticizing investigators for their supposed incompetence. But the cost of this victory was the truth itself, and more importantly, justice for JonBenét. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney's Office officially cleared the Ramsey family of suspicion, citing DNA evidence that supposedly pointed toward an unknown intruder. This exoneration was celebrated as vindication of the family's innocence and condemnation of those who had suspected their involvement. However, experts later revealed that the DNA evidence was far less conclusive than presented. The samples were minimal, possibly from manufacturing contamination, and certainly not sufficient to eliminate family members as suspects or prove the existence of an intruder. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, continues to advocate for renewed investigation into his daughter's murder. He regularly appears on television, gives interviews, and maintains his family's innocence. He's become a symbol of perseverance in the face of injustice, at least according to the narrative he's helped create. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006 from ovarian cancer, taking whatever secrets she possessed to her grave. Her death eliminated the person who, according to multiple investigators, was most likely responsible for writing the ransom note and staging the crime scene. Burke Ramsey, now in his 30s, has lived his entire adult life under the shadow of his sister's murder. In 2016, he broke his decades-long silence in a televised interview, denying any involvement in JonBenét's death. His demeanor during the interview, smiling inappropriately while discussing his sister's murder, sparked renewed speculation about his psychological state and potential involvement. But perhaps most tragic is what happened to those who tried to speak the truth. Detective Linda Arndt never returned to law enforcement after facing death threats and professional ostracism for describing her observations on that fateful morning. Steve Thomas left police work entirely, his reputation forever linked to a case where speaking truth became career suicide. James Kohler faced legal challenges for revealing evidence in his book, forcing him to carefully navigate what he could disclose without facing prosecution. Other investigators learned to remain silent rather than risk their careers by challenging the accepted narrative. This raises profound questions about American justice. What happens when wealth and legal resources become more powerful than evidence and truth? What happens when public relations campaigns successfully rewrite the facts of a criminal case? What happens when speaking truth becomes more dangerous than concealing it? The JonBenét Ramsey case represents a watershed moment in American criminal justice, the point where we learned that with enough money, legal expertise, and media manipulation, even the most compelling evidence can be neutralized and the most credible witnesses can be silenced. But it also represents something else: the power of ordinary people to preserve truth even when institutions fail. The housekeepers, gardeners, detectives, and investigators who spoke out knew they were risking their careers and personal safety. They spoke anyway because they believed JonBenét deserved better than a cover-up disguised as a mystery. Their testimony, preserved in interviews, books, and court documents, ensures that the truth survives even when justice fails. Future generations will be able to read their words and understand what really happened in that Boulder mansion on Christmas night 1996. And that brings us to you, the viewers who have followed this investigation to its conclusion. You've now heard testimony that mainstream media largely ignored. You've seen evidence that contradicts the official narrative. You've learned about witnesses whose voices were silenced and investigators whose careers were destroyed for seeking truth. The question now is what you'll do with this knowledge. Will you share these revelations with others who deserve to know the truth? Will you support content that goes beyond surface-level reporting to examine evidence that powerful interests prefer to keep hidden? Because here's the reality: 98% of you watching this video won't subscribe to this channel. Most of you will move on to other content without taking any action to support the kind of in-depth investigation that brought you these suppressed truths. And that passivity is exactly what allows cases like JonBenét's to remain unsolved while the evidence pointing toward resolution is ignored. If this investigation has opened your eyes, if these revelations have challenged what you thought you knew about one of America's most famous cold cases, then prove it. Subscribe to support content that pursues truth regardless of how powerful the forces opposing it might be. Or, if you won't subscribe, at least tell me why in the comments. What would it take for you to support investigative journalism that goes where mainstream media fears to tread? 28 years have passed since JonBenét Ramsey's murder, and the case remains officially unsolved. But as we've seen throughout this investigation, unsolved doesn't mean unknowable. The evidence exists. The witnesses have spoken. The truth has been revealed by those brave enough to risk everything in pursuit of justice. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old when her life was brutally cut short. She loved performing, dreamed of becoming a star, and trusted the adults in her life to protect her. Instead, according to the investigators who knew the case best, she became the victim of family violence that was then covered up through one of the most sophisticated deception campaigns in criminal history. The little girl who should be celebrating her 34th birthday today instead remains frozen in time, not just as a victim of murder, but as a symbol of how justice can be subverted when truth becomes inconvenient for those with the power to reshape it. Her story reminds us that in America, money doesn't just buy legal representation, it can buy reality itself. With enough resources, evidence can be discredited, witnesses can be silenced, and even the most compelling case for justice can be transformed into an unsolvable mystery. But JonBenét's story also reminds us of something else: the power of ordinary people to preserve truth even when institutions fail. The housekeepers who observed disturbing family dynamics, the gardeners who witnessed suspicious behavior, the detectives who counted their bullets in fear, the investigators who sacrificed their careers to speak out, they ensured that the truth would survive even if justice was denied. Their testimony lives on in interviews, books, and court documents that future generations will be able to access. They made sure that JonBenét's real story, not the sanitized version promoted by public relations campaigns, would be preserved for history. As we conclude this 28-year journey through one of America's most controversial criminal cases, the question isn't whether we know what happened to JonBenét Ramsey. According to the investigators who devoted years of their lives to seeking justice for her, we do know. The question is whether we care enough about truth to demand accountability from the systems that failed her. The evidence presented by Linda Wilcox, Brian Scott, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, Detective Linda Arndt, Steve Thomas, James Kohler, and others paints a clear picture of what occurred that Christmas night. A family under pressure, a child whose behavior triggered explosive rage, parents who chose to protect their surviving child through elaborate deception, and a justice system that allowed wealth and influence to triumph over evidence and truth. JonBenét deserved better. She deserved a childhood free from the pressures that drove her family to dysfunction. She deserved protection from violence, even when that violence came from within her own home. She deserved justice when that protection failed. Most of all, she deserved a society that would pursue truth regardless of how powerful the forces opposing it might be. Thank you for following JonBenét's story to the end. If this case moved you, if these revelations challenged what you thought you knew about one of America's most famous mysteries, then hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that deserve to be heard, more truths that powerful interests prefer to keep hidden. Share your thoughts, your feelings, and your final theory in the comments. Do you believe the investigators who devoted their careers to this case? Do you think justice was subverted by wealth and influence? Or do you still believe that some unknown intruder killed JonBenét Ramsey and vanished without leaving credible evidence? Most importantly, will you help ensure that cases like this, where truth is suppressed and witnesses are silenced, continue to be investigated and exposed? Because in the end, the only way we can honor JonBenét's memory is by refusing to let her story be forgotten, distorted, or buried beneath the lies that have concealed it for 28 years. The truth about what happened to JonBenét Ramsey has been revealed by those who were there, who saw the evidence, who knew the family, and who risked everything to speak out. Now it's up to us to decide whether that truth matters enough to demand the justice that has been denied for far too long. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, August 6, 1990 to December 25, 1996. Gone but never forgotten. Her story lives on in the courage of those who refuse to let truth be silenced, and in the hope that someday, somehow, justice will finally be served.